We all know that the real work of writing is in revision, but it can be hard to know what to do with a poem once you've written a first draft. However, it gets a lot easier to make good revisions when you get good feedback, and even when you see someone else get feedback. I can still remember, for example, the priceless lesson one of my teachers taught by crossing out unnecessary words and lines in someone else's poem. It wasn't direct feedback on my own writing, but it taught me what to look for, and it has helped me to write more economically since. So, with that in mind, I'm excited to bring an end to our National Poetry Month festivities by looking at a few of the poems you've sent in. As always, I'm grateful to all who have sent in work and to those few whose poems are up for discussion today. Be sure to show your support to these brave writers for trusting us with their work. Of course, we've done this before, so I don't need to explain too much, but beyond practicing looking at your work with a more critical eye, the poems we're looking at today will give us a good chance to talk about writing economically, amplifying and clarifying meaning, and even the implications of form. We've got a lot of good stuff, so let's get right into the first piece. Dinner time for Bonnie. It's dinner time for Bonnie now. It's time for her to eat. Put on her bib and lift her up to slip into her seat. Bring on the bowl and fork and spoon. Uh-oh, a change of plans. She's overturned the whole dang lot. She'll eat it with her hands. The carrot's going down quite well. The cabbage she adores. Potato's not her favorite. It's wound up on the floor. You never know from day to day what she'll want and what she'll need, just as long as every single day she has a decent feed. So here we have a playful little piece about how the realities of feeding a, we'll presume, baby conflict with parental intentions. The titular Bonnie is not playing the utensils game, opting for her hands and eating what she wants, regardless of what anyone else might think she should be eating. The poem's form, written in common meter, contributes to that playful vibe. Jaunty iambs and regular rhymes recall childhood and give the poem an orderliness that contrasts with the harmless chaos of the moment it describes. There really is a lot to like here, but I think there are two things that I would focus on in particular if I were revising this poem. And of course, like with everything I'll suggest in this video, these are things I would consider based on my experience as a reader and writer. There's just no one way to tackle revisions. These are, after all, options, not corrections. Anyway, the first is information density, or compression. I'm struck from the start that the title and first two lines more or less all say the same thing. With such a short poem, real estate comes at a high price, so spending that space for the poem just to repeat itself is a sign that things could be working more efficiently. So one thing to start looking out for is where the poem presents new and important information. Anything that adds meaning to the poem rather than just provides grammatical or logistical information or even nice but non-essential details. In my reading, here are the parts that really count towards what this poem has to say. Some of the other details here might be nice to have, but the core action of the poem will still make sense without them. Looking at it another way, all of these parts are parts that we can afford to lose without harming the core of the poem. So, since we have such malleable space in the first two stanzas, what if we ended up with something like this to start the poem? Dinner time for Bonnie. Rejecting bib and fork and bowl, she's overturned our plans for her to eat a mannered meal. She'd rather use her hands. And of course, there are other things we could do. This revision, for example, is maybe a little weak on imagery, but this one stanza manages to cover a lot of the ground that the first two stanzas cover in the original. And it makes a bigger deal of a potential source of central motivating tension for the piece. The parental motive to teach some social norms being frustrated by the baby's blissful disregard for what's proper. Which brings us to the second priority I would consider for revising this piece. At the end, we get a little reflection that the parent doesn't really know what to expect from the child, that her preferences and needs take precedence over plans. And I think there's an interesting point to be made there, but it's presented in a fairly muted way. Like, this could be a piece that reveals that practical insight of the baby. A parent realizes that the norms don't matter as much as following one's natural intelligence or instinct, or that feeding the body matters more than following the rules. As it's originally written, I could imagine a reader saying, yeah, babies are like that, but what's your point? I think there is a point, but the poem could arrive at it more resolutely. So planting the seeds for that tension in the first stanza could help to set up a more satisfying conclusion. That is, I can kind of see why this might be interesting. It's not just that babies are messy. but the poem doesn't make as much of its underlying motive as it could. So, of all the poems that could be written, why this poem about this experience feeding a baby? At this point, a reader is more or less left to guess, but how much more resonant could this poem become if it let us in on the speaker's motivations and insight? I, for one, can't help but think that that could amplify this poem's effect, and it would go from being a fun piece about feeding a baby to something that offers a little more meaningful insight into something like parenting or whatever else drew this writer to write this piece. Now, real quick, before we move on to the next poem, in addition to submitting your work for a chance to have it discussed on the show, I'm also available to work with you one-on-one. Over the last year, I've worked with writers on individual poems and book-length projects, I've brainstormed video ideas, and even helped people prepare for academic presentations. And I'm especially excited to announce that, since earlier this year, I finally opened these services to international clients. So now, whatever you're working on and wherever you're located, I'm here to help. You can find more information in the description. And with that, let's get on to our next piece. Legend. At the end of the secret meeting, you died. Some distance away, a witch hazel opened its first buds to greet the stretching and opaque sky that kept bridging distances. What was left for me to do with our us left hanging? I walked around almost casually and sat on the blue couch to type this. I settled into the plot of my only heart, as if ready for another exasperated start. This is a compelling piece that starts out with a clear tension and moves through some really interesting lines. I like the specificity of witch hazel, the syntax twisting inventiveness of what was left for me to do with our us, and the nice little resolving rhyme at the end. Here we have a speaker who is confronting the dissolution of some kind of relationship. The poem says died, but there's something in the poem's looseness with the conventions of language that's pushing me to read that non-literally. And then the witch hazel, which is, according to my light internet research, associated with broken hearts, which moves us into the wide yet connecting expanse of sky, and then we zoom back in on a speaker composing the poem. There's a lot of cool stuff here. For me, this poem's approach to language is probably its most salient feature. I do find its unconventional syntax and diction to be really interesting, but as rhetoricians are fond of saying, there are no neutral choices. And the pleasures of this linguistic style also come with some costs. And the first, of course, is that doing unconventional things creates issues for clarity. The style here teaches me not to take things too literally, so I don't want to read the death as literal, but it's also stated so straightforwardly that I kind of doubt my metaphorical reading of the line. And then there's the line, what was left for me to do with our us left hanging? I like the idea of using our us as shorthand for the relationship, and putting the possessive in front of us helps us to parse the unconventional syntax. Plus, I'm generally in favor of slashing question marks. But this is a sentence that may challenge some readers. And of course, there's room for desirable difficulty in our reading, but it's always worth considering the implications of those choices. Accessible writing is not the only or even necessarily highest priority, but a line that flouts conventional syntax and punctuation may put some readers off. And in this case, that might be an affordable loss. And I have a sense that this writer is being fairly deliberate with these choices, but it's worth mentioning that difficulty likely translates to a smaller readership. Of course, you're always allowed to write whatever and however you want, so long as you're being intentional about it and its effects on your intended audience. Now, stylistic or aesthetic differences aside, I do find this poem's tendency towards imprecision and negation to be a little more straightforwardly problematic, and more likely to work against the clarity of the poem's gesture. So, for example, we get some distance away, almost casually, and as if ready. And, well, some distance doesn't tell us where something is other than not here. Almost casually doesn't really tell us how the speaker moved, only how they didn't move, and as if ready isn't ready, but what exactly is it? In each of these cases, the poem leans into an imprecise negation, so we know what isn't happening or what isn't quite happening, but not what is happening. And as interesting as that effect is in a poem where we know what a relationship isn't, but not what that relationship is, it can also be a frustrating strategy. And I don't mean frustrating in the sense of makes me mad, but frustrating in the sense of halts my progress. If there are 112 things that something could be, and the poem tells me one thing that it isn't, well, I still have 111 options to choose from. So to learn that the speaker walked around almost casually gets me closer, but not quite to the actual action. The practical effect of that is that I find myself reading this poem with diminished confidence that I'm getting it right. At best, I can say that I almost get it, which is roughly equivalent to not getting it, and where this poem does show that it can be fantastically precise with the witch hazel and opaque sky, the imprecisions in the piece feel more like they're falling short of that high standard set elsewhere than like they're a satisfying subversion of expectations. So, as much as possible, I try to look for ways to preserve the more interesting twists of language, while also making sure to tighten up the imprecise phrases in order to help readers stay on track and also encourage them to face the satisfying difficulties the poem offers. Of course, where that balance lies exactly is probably a matter of taste more than absolute truth, and I'm pretty sure that I'm on record as sitting more towards the accessible end of the spectrum than the obscure one. But in any case, the goal here would be to amplify the poem's satisfyingly unconventional language by clarifying the imprecise phrases that may read less like inventiveness and more like a lack of control. But now, on to our last piece of the day. I'll sit and watch the rain, companion to keep me sane, liquid silver on the window pane. May will come, blooming, boisterous, with flowers to pester us. May will come. May, mays, and May to mays. May. But May can wait. Now I watch April rain. This one comes with its own distinct visual packaging, which is fun to see. I like the rain and flowers that match the poem's content, and the blue frame for the poem is pretty nice too. There's a charming simplicity to this presentation, like it was all cut out of paper and glued together. As for the verbal part of the poem, though, this piece is clearly having a lot of fun with language, which I'm all for. We have rhyming and fun images, and of course this attention-grabbing clump of maze, which ends in the speaker setting all that aside, and watching the rain, or if we take the pun seriously, the rain of April. Plus, we're playing with the saying April showers bring May flowers, and it's fun to see a poem respond to and play with that kind of conventionalized language. With the line keeping me sane, we get a certain sense of anxiety, amplified by the idea that May flowers will pester us, and then dialed up even more with the almost frenetic repetition of the word May. May is coming, and that seems to be an uncomfortable thing. But for now, we and the speaker get to settle into some peaceful contemplation of the rain in April. Now, first things first, what I wouldn't give for a title. I'll hear people go to great lengths to try to justify their lack of titles, but the most common excuse is just that it's hard, and that's fair. Titles can be hard. But I've also heard more than one poet say that titles can work like keys to unlock a poem. So just imagine what would happen if this poem were called Sitting by the Window at the End of the World, or Graduation is Next Month and I Don't Have a Job, or My Allergy Medicine Has Run Out, or April Showers That May Sours, or On the Looming Realization that the DA is building an unbeatable case and my criminal empire is due to collapse around me at any moment. See, the titles make a difference. Even without changing the poem at all, the title works kind of like a prism, scattering the light in a different way and bringing out different resonances and meanings. Without a title, this poem offers some nice experiences. But a title is an efficient way to get a lot out of a poem without having to put anything more into that poem. So say it with me. Don't overlook titles. Now, this stanza is a real center of gravity for this piece, so let's take a closer look at it. At first glance, it's reminding me of those stunt sentences like buffalo, 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 or police, 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 police. And those are fun, but what are all the meanings of May? Well, this gets tricky, but we can at least mark out syntactical roles here. The month of May and the auxiliary verb may are easy enough to parse out, but that leaves us with another verbal may and another noun to figure out. And thanks to our friend, the Oxford English Dictionary, we have some options. For the nouns, we have an archaic version that means a maiden or young woman, or a noun form of the verb, or a fully obsolete, which is to say, not attested after 1335 in the OED, noun referring to a male relative. And for the verbs, a verb meaning to take part in May Day festivities, or to be dismayed, again last recorded in the OED in 1575. The structure of the second line of this stanza gets tricky because it looks to have a transitive form of may, with mays as a plural direct object, but only the obsolete sense of dismaying or the even rarer and still obsolete sense of covering with hawthorn blossoms are transitive. So I'm probably missing something obvious, but I think I might be stuck. The syntax is tricky enough, and the semantic sense of the words adds layers of complication. Now, I'm just saying, if this stanza has driven me to the OED, well, let's just say that most readers probably aren't putting in that kind of effort. Which brings me to the larger point. As confounding as this stanza has the potential to be, I also just really like it. It's such a fun way to put attention on the strangeness of language. It's really cool, and I would be pretty proud of myself for pulling off something like this. But I've also learned the hard truth that sometimes the parts that I like best in my own poems don't always serve the poems they're in. Sometimes I'm being clever and amusing myself and distracting in the end from the heart of the poem. You've heard the idea that revision involves killing your darlings. And to me, that doesn't so much express the difficult realities of revision as it signals that I ought to be most suspicious of the lines that I'm most proud of. Are they there because I want to show them off, or because they communicate my meaning to my audience in the most effective way? More often than not, at least for me, they're usually just there because I want to show off. And when I'm honest about it, they don't make it into the final draft. So because I like it, I'm hesitant to say that this stanza needs to be cut, but I do raise the possibility because it also presents a steep challenge to readers. Is it essential for readers to understand what this stanza is really saying? If so, they probably need some help making sense of it, and maybe a strong sense of repetition is possible without it being so insistent. Kind of in the way that alliteration is still noticeable even when only a few words in a sentence rather than all of them start with the same sound. Or maybe the disorientation is exactly the point. But is the road to disorientation worth all the readers who might take detours through dictionaries and etymologies to try to reorient themselves? In that case, maybe signaling that this isn't meant to be understood so much as felt, maybe with a line like, "And my mind loops past meaning, May will come," could then turn a reader away from feeling like they need to go do some homework first. Or, of course, maybe it is just a little stunt that, while amusing, just doesn't quite serve the reader or poem as well as it could. In that case, something more straightforwardly meaningful might be the most appropriate choice. And where the rest of the poem works through straightforward language and concrete images, that might actually be the best option for consistency. As always, it's a question of the effect the writer wants to achieve, and it's good to consider options because it can be tricky to predict where readers will go. What seems obvious to us as writers is seldom as obvious to readers if we don't provide at least a little orienting help. And with that final note, we'll bring today's poetry review to a close. Thanks again to our writers for their submissions and for allowing us all to benefit from talking about different possibilities and considerations in their work. As always, the best I can do is offer information about my experience as a reader in order to help inform writing decisions. But the end result is always in the writer's hands. And of course, thanks again to all of you for watching. If you'd like to share your work with the show, or if you'd like to work with me one-on-one, links for more information are in the description. And if not, just showing up to watch is such a wonderful way to support the show. I really do appreciate it. Now go have a great week of writing, revising, or whatever else, and we'll meet again in the next one.